Well, I want to thank everybody for attending, and I also do want to say a quick thank you to my mentor, Cricket Walker, because she was the one who taught me about SEO, and she actually recommended WordPress to me back in 2006, 2007, so I've been using it ever since. If you guys want to pull up the presentation, the link is up here on the slides, and I've also posted it on Twitter and the Slack channel to make it a little easier, because I know it's not a memorable URL. There will also be handouts a little later in the session, so don't worry about writing down any of these links that I'm going to be talking about. Studies show that organic search is sending more and more traffic to higher ed websites. Back in October of 2014, it accounted for about 32% of higher ed traffic, according to the study that's linked at the bottom. And as of August 2015, it had jumped up to 41%. That number just continues to grow. So for those of you who maybe only know how to spell SEO, here's a really quick 30-second introduction. SEO stands for Search Engine Optimization. Search engines like Google and Bing have computers called spiders that crawl across the web following links. That's how they learn what websites are out there. When a human types a keyword into a search engine, what they get back is a SERP, or a search engine results page. What you're trying to do with SEO is show up on that page when someone searches for something that you offer. Diving into our hacks, I want to show you a tool you can use even if you cannot edit your website. You have zero access, and this is called a site query. When you're searching Google or Bing, you can type in site:your domain, for example, site:ku.edu, and the search engine will show you all the pages it knows about. The first couple of pages should really contain your top content, and if you see really unimportant pages showing up there, it might be a good idea to check and see how many links you have pointing to those pages. You want to try to add links throughout your site to the more important pages, so Google will come along and say, hey, this must be something they really want people to see. Site search is also a good way to see if any key pages are missing, and it can warn you about duplicate content. If you go to the last page of your site search, if Google thinks you have duplicate content, you will see a little link to repeat the search with omitted results included. You might realize you have 2 news articles from 2 different years that have almost the same content, or somehow you have 2 copies of a page floating around, and it's a good idea to consolidate those. So Wapu here is here to show us how doing SEO is like baking chocolate chip cookies. There are hundreds of different cookie recipes, but most of them have a lot in common. If you're making chocolate chip cookies, odds are you're going to need some flour, some sugar, and chocolate chips, right? Even if you're making a snickerdoodle or an oatmeal raisin cookie, you're still going to need the flour and the sugar. And there are some things so crucial to your recipe that your cookies won't turn out right without them, like baking soda. You can have really flat cookies without that. Not that I would be speaking from experience. So much like cookies, there are different kinds of SEO. Some of them are clearly bad, like watermelon Oreos. There are some SEO techniques called black hat techniques that can get you blacklisted in Google. But a lot of techniques are called white hat techniques, and you can't really say one is necessarily better than the other. You can say you like one better or one works better on your sites. So since chocolate chip cookies are arguably the most popular, I'm going to give you what equates to a chocolate chip SEO recipe today. And if our helpers could pass out the handouts, please. These are the recipes for you today. So some people claim that Google has over 200 ranking factors. In all truth, it's probably a lot more than that. They don't release their algorithm to the public because people would find ways to game this system. But the SEO community has found some conclusions about what matters the most. Now keep in mind, if this were a perfect world and you did absolutely everything the SEO experts recommend, it would be just like trying to get in all your FDA daily guidelines in. All the fiber, all the protein, don't exceed your calorie limit or eat too much saturated fat. You would spend all your time planning your meals or your SEO and have no time left to live. So just try to tackle one thing at a time, experiment with it, learn more about how it affects your website, and then branch out and try something new. So since our goal is to show up in search results, our first SEO ingredient, our flour equivalent, is keywords. Now, of all the SEO factors out there, keywords are historically the most abused. Back in the 90s, does anybody remember dialing into AOL and firing up Ask Jeeves? Back then, people figured out that if you put a meta keyword tag on your homepage and put in Britney Spears, XXX, Britney Spears, you would suddenly pop up to the top of the search engines. You'd get a ton of traffic. Now, if you didn't actually mention Britney Spears on your website, your visitors probably wouldn't stick around. But back then, you just wanted your hit counter to show more hits. Over time, Google figured out people were gaming the system, and they stopped using meta keywords as a ranking signal. So unless you have another good reason unrelated to SEO, just don't even bother using meta keywords. They're not helpful, and they can actually be harmful in some cases. So then, why did I say keywords are the first ingredient? It's because you need to use keywords in your code and your content. You need to know your audience, whether you're talking to alumni, prospective students, and you also need to know what kinds of terms they're using to search for the type of content that you're providing. In that ideal world where you get all your FDA requirements, you'd be using just the right mix of keywords on every page of your whole website. Since this is not a perfect world, start by researching some keywords for your top pages, the most important places you need people to find. So to do some keyword research, you should sign up for a Google AdWords account. I'm not trying to trick you into pasting pay-per-click ads. I just want you to try out the free AdWords Keyword Planner tool. You type in a keyword or the URL you want people to visit, and there's a set of checkboxes you can use to restrict the results. I really recommend using your country as a starting point because if you get too far local, you won't get very broad results. And if you go international, you may have people using different terms than what your audience uses. You'll get a list of related keywords and an estimate of how many times people search for those keywords every month. You may find people are using a different term than you've published. Say people are searching for dorms and you say residence halls on your site. The more keyword research you do, the more you can tweak the content that you already have, and the more you may see you have some holes that you can fill in with information that people are searching for. Two other keyword tools are Moz and Google Search Console, which used to be called Webmaster Tools. They tell you the keywords you're already ranking for, along with a lot of other things like how high you're ranking for each keyword. Now, Moz, M-O-Z, is a paid SEO service. Their keyword tool will give you the most help with your research if you can afford it. They also have a ton of free information about SEO, as well as forums, so you should check them out at moz.com. So when you have a web page, you have to have a way to get to that web page, right? We call this a URL. Let's call them the butter in our recipe because they give sites their structure and make them stick together. There are a couple of different parts to the URL. There's the domain, your .edu or your .com or your .whatever you have, and then there's the permalink. Your domain's age has some effect on your SEO. Older domains are helpful because Google has known about them for longer, and it can also help a tiny bit to have your registration extend into the future. By registering your domain for 5 years instead of 1, you're telling Google, I'm not going to throw this site away for a few years, so I'm going to keep it around. The second part of the URL, the permalink, is something you have probably a lot more control over. WordPress will automatically create permalinks for you based on your title that you enter, but you can also adjust them manually. It used to be that Google really liked keyword repetition like mydomain.edu/aboutmycampus/aboutmyWhole-university. But now they favor simpler, shorter permalinks. Just /about is going to be a lot better. For one thing, if a visitor looks up there, it's almost like a breadcrumb and they can tell where they're at really easily. If the keywords make sense, by all means, throw them in there. All of your URLs should be lowercase, and instead of spaces or underscores, you should use hyphens to separate words. Search engines understand them better than any other character for separating words. Don't throw any special characters, apostrophes, anything crazy in there, because they can break your site, or they can cause WordPress to put in encoded characters. I'm sure you've seen spaces that become %20s and all kinds of things like that. It's just a little harder if somebody's typing in your URL to take the time to do that. But I don't want you to go out and change all your keywords because your permalinks, because it will break any incoming links you have to those pages. Instead, just keep all these rules in mind moving forward. And if at some point you have some major change in navigation, you're changing a lot of things, you can address a whole batch at once. Whenever you do change a permalink, you also need to create a 301 redirect. This way, live visitors will go straight to the new page. They won't know the difference, but search engines will see the redirect, make a note of the new URL, and update their index. Now, even when you put in the exact perfect kind of redirects, the 301s, your pages are going to lose a little bit of their authority in SEO. So don't change them unless you have a good reason, or like I said, a major redesign where you're overhauling the navigation. Next up, we have a really simple little hack. It may look intimidating with code, but it's actually really easy. That is, make sure you have these two files, robots.txt and sitemap.xml. By default, WordPress creates a robots.txt for you, but you should check its contents. You want to make sure everything except your WP admin folder is crawlable. Now, we have some, like our catalog, that's an old URL. We have a whole new site for that. That's why we have disallowed, because the crawlers just keep coming back and back, even though that content's been gone for months. The Sitemap Xml file is structured specifically for spiders, so they can see the hierarchy of your website. There are a ton of different plugins that can create this for you, but I recommend using Yoast Seo, which also does a ton of other useful stuff. These two spider files are like the salt in your recipe. You only need a little pinch, and you would get edible cookies without them, but they're so easy to set up, you should include them. Next up, we're going to touch on a topic you might not associate with SEO, which is security. But think of it this way. If your site gets hacked and you're spamming the web with Viagra ads, do you think your scholarly journals are going to rank quite as high for the terms you want them to? Probably not. So our next ingredient, which equates to sugar, keeping our site sweet, is to secure your website. That is a whole topic in and of itself, but a few highlights are, first off, make sure your whole website is more secure by installing an SSL certificate. That puts the little HTTPS in the padlock in some browsers. Now, there's a free service called Let's Encrypt that will give you the certificate now. And if you're on SiteGround for hosting, it's like a 2-click process in cPanel. It's really easy. Another tip is to use a security plugin. My personal favorite is WordFence. There's a free version and a premium version. The premium's not very expensive, and it does a lot of extra stuff. A few other things to do are never use the admin username, because that's the first thing hackers are going to try, and then they've got half of the key to your website. Also, a lot of themes will display the author's name for posts, so you also don't want to show your visitors the username there. If you go into your dashboard to the users, there's what's called a nice name. So you can change, so you log in with one username, and you're displaying a different one on the site, so people don't know how to actually log in with that. The last security hack is to enable two-factor authentication on your site. Two-factor means that in addition to your one-factor, your username and password, you have a separate factor like either an app or a text message that proves that you're really you when you're getting in there. In the paid version of WordFence, it comes with text messaging, and it just texts you a little code that you add to your password to log in. It's quick and easy for you, but for a hacker, it's a lot harder to bypass. And there are lots of other plugins also besides WordFence that will do this for you. So on the lighter side, you can't have a chocolate chip cookie without chocolate chips, right? So just like you can't have a web page without some content. You want to have lots of different kinds of content, images, videos, lists, and your website shouldn't be an academic paper, it should be an interactive brochure. So Google is working on object recognition, but the fact is spiders cannot actually see your images. So they do the same thing a visually impaired person might do. They check your alt text. When you overlook this tag, or if you don't make good use of it, you're going to frustrate both humans and spiders. As soon as you upload an image, immediately assign alt text to it so you don't forget. If you pretend there's someone in the next room and you're dying to tell them about this image, what would you say to get them come take a look at it? Would you say, "This lolcat is hilarious"? Or would you say something like, "Check out this cat stuck inside a package of water bottles. You got to come see this"? Which one is going to convince them better? That's the one that you want to use to tell both search engines and visually impaired visitors more about your content. So spiders, like people, also use file names to figure out what's in an image. How many times have you seen an uploaded file like img142.jpg? Once you know your keywords for a page, try naming your images something relevant. So if I'm uploading a picture of students volunteering, I could name it something like stmu-students-volunteer.jpg. Just like URLs, stick to the lowercase letters, use hyphens to separate your words, and you don't really want these to get too terribly long. Usually about 2, maybe 3 hyphens, so 2 to 3 to 4 words at the most. To help these images load faster, you should resize and compress them. Even if it takes you an hour, it's going to save your visitors 10 times that amount of time loading them. If you know you haven't resized everything, maybe you've got some rogue content editors who have no idea what Photoshop is, there is a free plugin called Insanity, and it can go right through your media library and compress everything for you. In addition to what you've already got, it can also help with future uploads, so this is a really good one to add. Another way to break up the monotony on your site, of course, is videos. They definitely have got to be compressed, and wherever you use them, our SEO trick is to use transcripts. Just like Google can't see images, it also can't watch a video. And again, you may have some people with disabilities, like hearing loss, who will really appreciate having that transcript. So by taking a few minutes to type out exactly word for word what's said in the video, you're serving your human visitors and the spiders, and both of these things can help your overall SEO, especially if you happen to use your keywords in your videos. The last type of content I'm going to mention is the one we all have the most of, text. There's no magic formula for the number of words you need on every page. You really just need to cover your topic in depth, make an effort to use your keywords when they sound natural, but don't force them. Search engines have gotten a lot smarter over the past few years about linguistics, and they're starting to recognize related phrases. And as usual, Google has learned when you use the same keyword on the page 70 times, you're probably a spammer. It used to be common practice in the SEO world to build out separate pages for every variation of a keyword, but now the best practice is actually to consolidate your content. Just have one page for a given topic and use your variations of your keyword throughout that page so you sound natural. You can read some tips about SEO copywriting over on Yoast's website, the same ones who put out the Yoast Seo plugin. It also helps your visitors and your search rankings when you break up your text. So I know it's hard to see, but just at a glance, which of these would you rather read? The one on the left with the gray background or the one on the right that has some images, some headings? It's probably going to be a little bit easier to skim through the one in the middle there. So use heading tags H1, H2, just like you would if you were writing an outline for a speech, and use lists to break up long blocks of text. A really cool benefit of doing all this is besides looking visually nicer, your content all of a sudden has some structure to it. So even if you haven't entered the 21st century, you don't have HTML5 in your theme, search engines look at your headings to determine what the page is about. And there's a free tool, there's a little screenshot up there on the right called Html5 Outliner. It's an add-on for Chrome that will show you your page's outline. It's a nice way to check and make sure your headlines really do sum up the topic. Google officially recommends that you have a maximum of 100 links per page. That's including your header, your footer, your sidebar, everything within paragraphs. That can be a really hard number for a large institution to achieve, but your navigation scheme should not look like your org chart. You can use tools like Crazy Egg and Google Analytics to find out the links that people are actually using and then trim down your header and footer. If you can reduce the number of links on a page and then also link out to one or more relevant resources on other sites where it's appropriate, Google also likes to see a website that's not standing totally on its own. So next up in our recipe is the eggs. The eggs hold the cookie together, just like your code holds your website together. You don't have to be a developer to change everything. Some of the code I want you to consider is right there in your themes and your plugins. Some themes are just inherently more SEO friendly than others. They load faster, they use elements like articles and sidebars instead of div, or table, grtdd. If you don't know much about code, this is something you may have to research, but it is worth the time to find either something that's available out there as a download or to hire someone to develop a custom theme for you. Our WPCampus survey found that over 50% of higher ed WordPress sites are using some kind of page builder where you can drag and drop things and make them really pretty without code. But the downside to these is page builders are made to be everything to everyone. They add a whole lot of overhead to your site, and it creates a lot more code wrapped around that juicy content. So honestly, to spiders, your code is more like the wrapper around the cookie than part of the cookie itself. They want to just peel it away and not be pulling on it like, hey, I'm going to have to use my teeth to get into this one. The code should be just enough to keep your content packaged neatly. The plugins are the same. They add extra code to your website. So just choose carefully and minimize the number of plugins you run. One that I already mentioned, Yoast Seo, is definitely worth the overhead. For starters, it lets you set page titles and meta descriptions. In case you don't know where those show up, your page title is the clickable link in a search engine result, and your meta description shows up right underneath it. You need these to be good for both people and search engines, because if you have a title like St. Mary's Dorms, Co-ed Dorms, Educational Dorms, people are not going to want to click on that. They'll think you're a spammer. So if you'll check Moz, they have some really great articles on titles and meta descriptions that go into a lot more depth. Themes and plugins are the basic side of code SEO. The more advanced part is when you use things like structured data. I'm going to call this the baking soda because it really helps your website rise. Structured data is really just a way of saying that in addition to your great content on your page, you have some code wrappers around it that specify extra information to things like search engines and also screen readers for disabled visitors. I have some real-world examples that I think you will find pretty interesting. St. Mary's, where I work, as you might imagine from the name, is a Catholic university. So I'm sure a lot of you have seen Google's knowledge graph. It's this box that shows up on the right side of some search results. So we see this box for St. Mary's, and you'll notice under social media, it displays notable alumni. So we have one notable alumna who is famous for, shall we say, her modeling expertise. And she ended up showing right on the front of this knowledge graph box. Apparently, one of our brothers did a search for the university, and from what I hear, he just about had a heart attack looking at her profile picture. So, what do you do in a case like this? I did some research, and I found out Google primarily pulls this kind of information for your knowledge graph from Wikipedia. What do you know? She had a Wikipedia page that linked to our Wikipedia page. So, what do? Yeah, she's an alum. Yeah, she is famous, but we really would like to feature someone else, please. So the first thing I did was submit feedback to Google. And it's hard to see here, but there's a little tiny feedback link right underneath your knowledge graph. So I very politely said, since we're a Catholic institution, we would prefer not to feature this person with a revealing photo. And guess what? A week later, her thumbnail had actually been updated. You could only see her face and not other details. So the problem was she was still in this top notable alumni section. So I had one of our work studies go to Wikipedia and remove the link to St. Mary's. But Google doesn't really like to take things away. It likes to add better content rather than removing anything. So I created a notable alumni page on our website. You notice how I called it the exact same thing Google calls it? It showcases the alumni we want to talk about, and the data is structured. There is a really, really cool website called Schema.org, which Google, Bing, Yahoo, and Yandex have all officially recognized. It's just a way to wrap metadata, extra data around your content. So we start out by telling spiders what this page is about. It's about St. Mary's University, the same one at this Wikipedia page. And you'll be able to zoom into these if you download them, but up here, hard to point from over here. But basically we say it's about St. Mary's. It's the same as this Wikipedia page. Next up we say, here's going to come a group of alumni from St. Mary's, and then each alum is wrapped in a div that identifies that particular chunk of code and content is all about one person. So inside there, we have the name, we have some same as code that links out to their biography, again, linking out to another related site. We show their gender, which we don't show visually on the page, it's just for search engines. We specify the image that shows the alum, and the bio is wrapped in a description tag. So this page is great for human visitors who want to learn about some famous alumni, but it's even better for spiders. And within a few weeks, Google had totally bumped that embarrassing alum out of our top 5, so she no longer appears up here. The alumni markup is just one of hundreds of different kinds of schema from schema.org. You have to roll up your sleeves a little and dig into some code, but voila, the brothers can search for their university without having a coronary. One of the other kinds of schema we use is event schema. You can actually see some of the upcoming events listed out in Google if you search for us down here. Our events come in through a feed. They're not on WordPress, they're a separate feed. So I created a page template within the theme that automatically pulls all these in and adds all these schema tags. So you can use schema right in your content. You can also use it in themes and plugins. There are some existing schema plugins out there, so I recommend trying a few of them out, seeing if any of them meet your needs. That way you're not pasting in HTML all the time. However you do it though, schema is a great way to boost your site's SEO. So along with this structured data, Google has a testing tool to make sure you're doing it right. It's called the Structured Data Testing Tool. You can either paste in a URL or paste in some code and find out whether or not it's recognizing all those tags that you just added. You can also check your Google Search Console and see what Google has identified on your live pages to make sure it's actually recognizing all that. If you can edit your theme, you can also use schema to describe different parts of your web pages in your templates. There's schema to define headers, for footers, for navigation. Please test all this out on a staging site so you're not breaking your live site, and make sure to put these in a child theme so you're not losing your customizations. If you're not able to add schema at all, you can do something similar right through Google Search Console, which is the second box here. This is second best because you're only providing this information to Google, not to Bing or anyone else, and Google's going to have to make some educated guesses based on what you tell it, but it can still be helpful. So right under the structured data area, you follow a link called Data Highlighter to get to this. They don't have nearly as many data types for schema, so you'll have to think carefully about what type of content, but it can still be used for things like events. And you basically just go through and with your mouse you highlight each required piece of information, and from that trains Google, this is where this lives, this is where the description lives, this is where the date lives, and it can learn from that. So besides schema, some other structured data types are Open Graph and Twitter cards. Yoast SEO can automatically do all these for you, so whenever you share on Facebook, for example, Yoast is smart enough to know that you're going to want your featured image shared with your post. That is another little hack to always set a featured image. Your theme has to support it, so you might have to look up how to enable them if it doesn't by default. Our next ingredient for non-coders is offsite links and reviews. I'm grouping them together because they all happen outside of your own website, and I'm calling them the hot water in our recipe. The more high-quality links you have pointing to your site, the better it is for SEO, because Google sees a lot of people are linking to you, which means you're popular. And of course, you'll also have more visitors coming in through those links themselves. For a while, the hottest thing in SEO was buying backlinks. But like always, Google caught on, and nowadays you really don't want to go out and build a bunch of links, buying or not, either way, because if they're poor quality links, meaning that the sites that are linking to you either are unrelated or their entire website is just a big old stack of links, Google recognizes that as a bad practice and will blacklist them. If you get too many blacklisted sites pointing to you, that puts mud on you and you may get blacklisted yourself. But some sites are going to, of course, link to you naturally. Students cite your work as a source. You might be in some legitimate higher ed directories. Maybe there's some news articles that point to your website. And those links are helpful because they're relevant and they're on legitimate websites. But an easy way to influence positive links is to get students to review your institution. Ask alumni to go to Google or Yelp and write you a review. Make sure you ask for an honest review, because if you pay people to write good reviews, you can get blacklisted right there. So just do something simple like reaching out on social media and asking them to review you. And some of these reviews may show up in your knowledge graph. 2 other quick offsite things you can do are to make sure your institution has a Wikipedia page and get listed in DMOZ. So if you have a page on Wikipedia already, it's usually best to just leave that alone, because Wikipedia really wants to feature content from the crowd. But if you don't have a page, see if you can have a student just create one with some basic information about your history. DMOZ is a directory that still has some SEO value. They're not associated with moz.com. Moz is an open source term that just means you're crowdsourcing and you're transparent. So it's the same spirit but different people. First, search and make sure you are not currently listed, because they really frown on duplicate submissions. But if you're not listed, research to figure out what category you best fit into. Sometimes it can help to search for your rivals to see where they're listing themselves. And then submit your website carefully one time. It can take up to months for you to show up, because every submission is actually reviewed by a live human being. But if you followed their guidelines, you should eventually show up there, and that is a great signal to search engines that you're running a legitimate website because you passed the human test. Our next ingredient is easier to do than to say: canonicalization. All it means is you add code on each page of your website that tells Google whether this is the original or this is a copy, and there's somewhere else that should be considered the original. Yoast will take care of a lot of this for you. So say I have a page at mydomain/about. Now, most of the time, the links that point to this page have a trailing slash, so a little slash at the end of the URL. But sometimes people link to that page and they don't have that slash. WordPress is smart enough to always display that page. It doesn't care whether I type in a slash or not. But Google will see the extra character and it thinks to itself, one of these things is not like the other. So normally it'll see them as 2 separate pages, even though they're actually the same. If you have canonicals enabled, you're safe. Each version will point to whichever version you prefer. Another type of canonical is called a hreflang tag. It's another one that's easier to do than to say. This is a tag that says, I have multiple copies of the exact same page. They're just translated. So we have one page on our site that talks about the counseling services we provide to the public, and we have a very large population around us that speaks Spanish. So on this one page, we duplicated the content. So we've got our English version and our Spanish version. Now, normally Google would see that and say, hey, this is duplicate content. But we added this tag by going into the theme in the page template and putting this tag only on those pages. This tag is a little different from rel canonical in that instead of listing one page as the authority, you list however many versions you have. So if you have a French version and a German version and a Spanish version, they're all going to be listed on all of the pages. That way Google can tell that there's no authority. These are all actually the same page in different languages. And canonicals are like the vanilla in your recipe. Yes, it can recognize duplicate content there on your same website, yes. Yep, it can be a duplicate content nightmare. Okay.
It's duplicate content, but it's not a language. So like, for example, in my university, they publish a news article, but then they publish a separate one for news media outlets like N5 in our areas, and it has more information such as their sources and stuff like that. So those aren't published. They're kind of published in a different feed. But is there a certain tag I could use for that situation?
I would use canonicals to point to the longer, more detailed version, honestly, because it's the authority. So our last chocolate chip SEO ingredient is the brown sugar, or the user experience. You might have some of the best content in the world on a very secure server, But if you put everything in 8-pixel Comic Sans, people are going to run for the hills. And guess who can measure that? Even if you don't use Google Analytics, Google puts cookies in all your visitors' browsers, a different kind of cookies. If they click on your link and they always use their back button to go right back to those search results, Google is going to tell that nobody's finding your page very valuable. Over time, if it happens a lot, they'll lower your ranking. User experience is a field in and of itself, but here's a checklist of the highlights. First off, you need to have a good mobile experience, which I'm sure you've heard many times already. Most of us are probably familiar with responsive design. It's definitely not the only way to handle things. Another thing that Google came out with recently is called AMP, for Accelerated Mobile Pages. Google has found that people are so desperate to have their pages load fast on their phone, they're willing to give up all the formatting, all the fancy fonts, all of that type of thing. So instead of showing a responsive page, you can actually create what's called an AMP page, which strips everything into tags even simpler than HTML, takes away all your custom fonts and some of your images, as you can see. It just shows your site icon instead of your logo. And with this, your pages load screaming fast. Automatic has made a free plugin to do this for you called AMP, and they'll automatically send them to the AMP version from Google. And everyone else on your site will see the regular version. They add the canonical tag automatically so you don't have duplicate content problems with it. It is also a good idea to check your pages with Google's mobile-friendly test. They'll give you advice on what you can improve. And another part of UX on a mobile device is making links clickable. If you have a phone number, it should be really easy for someone using their iPhone to touch and call you. Don't ever put a phone number in an image, because people will have to switch back and forth between Safari and their phone trying to remember to type in that number. And if they're like me, they're not going to remember it. They may give up. If you already have your phone number as text, you can make it an actual link that references the phone number to make it easier on older smartphones to recognize it's dialable. It's little touches like that that can make the difference between someone calling admissions right away or giving up. You also need to make it easy to read all the text on your mobile pages. Whether you have responsive or mobile site or fluid site, whatever you have, make sure all the text is at least 14 to 16 pixels so people won't feel like they're at the eye doctor failing a vision test. So load time, of course, doesn't just affect mobile visitors, it affects people using their blazingly fast conference room computer from 2005. Your website needs to be fast for everybody. Some of the things you can do to speed it up are find a better theme, reduce the number of plugins you're running, enable caching, and install a CDN, a content delivery network, so your image files will come from a server that's physically closer to your visitors. You can check out your site speed using PageSpeed Insights or webpagetest.org, and again, these are all on the back of your recipe cards. Some other things that affect all your visitors, no matter what kind of device they're using, are your navigation and your calls to action. You want to make it really easy for people to find pages and know what to do once they get there. For example, the default WordPress search function works about as well as sticking a textbook under your pillow to study for finals. So if you have a little budget available, try using a search service. We use SwiftType at St. Mary's, which is a paid service that can crawl any website. It doesn't have to be WordPress, it can be any platform. It already does a better job out of the box than regular WordPress search, and there are lots of customizations you can do. So let's say people are searching for graduation on your website, but you refer to commencement. You can either bump up a search result. So for the graduation keyword, I've made commencement the primary search result. SwiftType also allows you to set up synonyms, so I don't have to manually go through there and do that for every permutation of graduation, graduation ceremony. If it's a synonym, it's really easy to define. If you're using WP Engine as your host, they'll give you Elasticsearch, which does similar things. Finally, make it easy for people to know what to do next. You should have a call to action on most of your pages. If visitors are on the registrar's page, give them a little menu of top actions like submit a transcript request, add a course. If they're reading an article from your alumni magazine, add some related articles at the bottom of the page so they can keep reading and stick around. Bottom line is UX is about making it easy for people to find things on your site and do things based on what they've found. So we have all our ingredients, but ingredients alone don't make a cookie. Even with a no-bake cookie, you're gonna have to mix everything, and I equate mixing to updating. By updating your content and your theme frequently, you're showing Google you're committed to improving over time. After you mix your ingredients, the last step, you have to put them in the oven and wait for that warm, mouth-watering, chocolatey goodness. It's the same for SEO. When you make changes, you have to wait for search engines to see them, and then you have to wait for them to change your ranking. Especially for brand new sites, you're likely to have to wait a while before you rank well for any of your keywords. So it's always good to run a few experiments, make changes here and there, see what works, and keep improving. So we've laid out a recipe for chocolate chip SEO. There's a whole world of cookies out there, but the basic principles of researching keywords and presenting high-quality content wrapped in easy-to-understand code apply to any SEO you do. And once you understand the basics, you can try adding frosting and sprinkles. Does anybody have some more questions?
I have a question. I'll go first. The words that go into your links, click here versus anything more descriptive. Do you, how important is it to be descriptive when you are linking to other content, your own or anybody else's?
It's actually not as important for SEO anymore. Google has figured people are gaming the system again. But from an accessibility standpoint, what I've learned is people with a screen reader can have a list of links. So if you have 5 links on your page that say click here and they're using that list, they have no idea what they go to. So having a little bit of context and a little more descriptive, like learn more even, is better than click here.
A microphone. Wow, I'm scared of the microphone. So really quickly, this is probably already on the website somewhere, but do you have a link to your slides because they're so
yeah, on Twitter and also in the Slack channel. Okay. And then if I can go...
It's already on the internet somewhere, I'm sure.
Yes, it is, and right here is the link as well, Great. This lovely, non-memorable thing. Yeah.
All right, but I'll find it on Slack or whatever.
Cool.
So for the, not Elasticsearch, but the other one that you mentioned, SwiftType, so is that a third-party service where you manage, but it still hooks back into it? Like, you know how on some websites you go on, it's like, search our website, and it's really just a Google search box on the site. And it just renders Google results.
No.
So this is hooking into WordPress's search and
it actually replaces it entirely.
Right. Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't use WordPress
because there's a number of plugins
that
do that that I've looked, and you've arrived at that one.
For multiple reasons, one of them being that we run multiple platforms, like our course leaf catalog, and we have alumni on a different site, things like that. It can go through all of them. It doesn't matter since it's a third party, and it crawls everything on those.
And it's compatible with all your, however you've done your WordPress
It can crawl
schema.
anything,
Okay,
yeah.
Great.
It can crawl straight HTML, whatever you need.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for the great presentation. The gentleman over there made me think, we just launched news.stanford.edu as a WordPress site, and so we have our primary news articles and tons of them, but we also launch support press releases that we specifically send out to journalists, and there is a lot of overlap in content. I'm now wondering if that's hurting us, and if so, maybe we should use that link. I'm thinking alternate or...
Yeah, you could use canonicals. Another thing you could do is just to de-index the ones that you're sending to the media if you don't need those available to the public, or vice versa. Yeah. Whichever version you need available through Google search, make that indexable. But in Yoast Seo, there's also a meta no index that tells search engines that even if you come across this page, just don't put it in your index, so it doesn't appear in search results even though it's on your site, visible to the public.
Yeah, we actually use Google Custom Search Engine, and we do want journalists to be able to search the press releases, so we just have 2 separate search engines, one that searches the news and the other that searches the press releases. But from Google's point of view, it has crawled both. So I'm
Yeah, I would
thinking,
use like a robots.txt to tell it this particular search engine has access, but block everybody else. That'd be an easy way to handle it through robots.txt.
okay, cool, thank you.
I just have a question about the AMP pages. So when we build our sites in WordPress and in Dreamweaver, we make sure that they're responsive. So how do we use the AMP pages, because they will load faster than our responsive pages? When will those appear as opposed to our responsive pages?
So those are a Google thing. So anytime you have AMP pages that Google knows about, and it only works for posts right now, not any of your other post types. Whenever Google sees a visitor going to one of those, it'll redirect it to the AMP version. Anybody who's already on your site or through any other search engine will hit your responsive version. So it's really only Google traffic that clicks on a link that Google knows has an AMP version.
So if we embed the idea of AMP pages for all of our posts and you go directly, so it's really only for direct links?
It's only for links from Google search results, yeah.
Thanks.
I'm just kind of curious about, does any kind of sharing on any social media affect search rankings? Like if you get something retweeted like 1 million times, does that matter?
Yeah, definitely. And it's not as much from the actual posts on social media as it is from Google seeing all of a sudden you've got a ton of incoming visitors. So it's more from a traffic standpoint than the actual social media itself.
Share it and not click the link. If they're only just sharing the tweet with the link in it, but not clicking the link to your actual website.
It won't help as much because Google, again, is looking at that traffic more so than the fact that there is a link somewhere.
Well, how would Google know about the traffic? Is it paying attention to your Google Analytics?
Google Analytics for sure, but again, even if you don't have that enabled, they're looking at how many people visit a site, how many clicks it gets, and then how many bounce right back to the search results because they didn't find what they were looking for.
All right, I think that's time.
Yep.
Thank you very much, Elaine.
Thanks, everyone.